I mean, where we come from in Delhi, this is eating our heart out. This is wonderful. You can breathe the air, and it's really really wonderful. It's heaven really. And when they say that it rains, right, it's especially in Delhi and now Punjabi, as we've discovered that we are, they say it always brings good omen. It's always a great.
Because I guess in Delhi we're always parched for rain and we've got extreme weather. It's extremely hot in summer, extremely cold in winter, and we dress accordingly. So this temperate weather is really, it's really a boon, and it's really lovely. It's evocative of so many feelings.
Yeah, and of course rain. So I think it's going to be and this thing, and I think it's perfect also because in some ways, your book is very evocative. It's evocative of feeling. It's evocative of space. It's evocative of nostalgia. It's evocative of a time.
Yeah.
If you haven't bought the book, I would highly recommend that you do. It is one of the most remarkable books I have read this year.
Thank you so much for saying that.
And so we discovered right now that we actually live practically next to each other in Delhi, and we've been there for about years, and we've never come across each other. But I think Radhika's book, and I'm going to give a background for anybody who hasn't read it to encourage it. It's really set. Do you want to talk about what it is, Radhika, and then I can come in? Do you want to give a background?
I could talk a little bit about the title of the novel.
Yeah.
It's called Of Mothers and Other Perishables. So it's really about the perishability of life and how fragile we are. And it really is about this one mother who's already dead. So the narrator of this book, one of the narrators of this book is already dead. And she longs for her life. She wants her life back, but clearly she can't have it. And so she inhabits this storeroom, which is where all her worldly belongings are, her silk saris, which are now wrapped in malmal. She had an old turntable, a sewing machine, vinyl records. She inhabits this storeroom as a dismembered voice. And the storeroom evokes all sorts of feelings in whoever reads it or whoever enters it. So she's got an elder daughter called the Wailer who enters the storeroom every now and then to look after it and to clean it up and to wrap and unwrap the saris. So the elder daughter has a very special relationship with the storeroom. While there's a younger daughter as well whose relationship is very different. She's averse to the storeroom and everything that it stands for. So this book is really about nostalgia and longing and about perishability as well, because we're all perishable. There's a Stoic philosopher called Marcus Aurelius. I don't know if you've read him. And he was also a Roman emperor, extremely powerful man, and he wrote this treatise called Meditations, in which he observes the beauty of a fruit in decay. For instance, he writes about how figs, when they're about to fall off a branch, have a peculiar beauty, and their perishability, their imminent perishability, lends them a certain decay. And that, I think, those tints and textures are what I've attempted to capture in the novel.
Sorry, it went off. And I think that's really at the heart of the book, this mother sort of looking back, and also this idea of the fragility that you said.
Yeah.
But the reason I also reacted to it, and we were talking about this, is that in some ways, I was telling Radhika that she is the perfect mother. If you look at motherhood now with the 21st century, very present mothers that everybody wants to be. And I try very hard to be a present mother. I have twin boys, 7 years old, which makes it very hard to be a present mother or a mother at all. But, the idea of this thing is that, in the 21st century, idea of motherhood is that you let them make the mistakes and you watch while they do it, because you must prepare them for life, for happiness, but much more for disappointment, because life is full of broken hearts, really. So you sort of equip them to deal with the hurt rather than just the love. And in the book, what is wonderful really is that the mother is watching her family from afar. Yeah. And she's watching these two girls and her daughters who don't have the best relationship at that point of time, and sort of wanting them to get okay. So it's, in some ways, it is also a metaphor for me, I thought, the way of motherhood, because your mothers go, but motherhood doesn't go. You're sort of doing this duty for the rest of your life, and you're sort of haunting your children's lives. Afterlife is also, motherhood. It's like Hotel California, you can't leave. But
check in but can't check out.
Can't check in, but check in but can't check out.
Yeah,
so can you talk about that?
It's an interesting take. I mean, the fact that she's a dead mother, so she clearly can't intervene in her children's lives, although she observes them. And I wanted to mention the fact that while she's dead, she's not really a ghost. So she has no agency. You know, she can't
Yeah.
lift objects, she can't walk through doors, and so she's just a dismembered voice.
She's not Patrick Swayze.
She's somewhat, yeah, if you want to call her
Yeah.
that. But she's also someone who's got this really tragic comic observation on whatever's going on in the house. So she notices the fact that, you know, the servant does not cook the way she would like him to. She notices the fact that her photographs are on Instagram. She's very cued into the world today. She's a modern she is a modern mother
Yeah.
in so many ways, and she sort of does not approve of her younger daughter's life choices. The younger daughter's dating this coffee startup CEO, and she can see through him. So she has this ability to see through people, but obviously, she can't. She has to withhold her opinions because no one can hear her, no
Yeah.
one can see her. She's just her opinions are actually available only to the reader. So the reader is privy to what's going on in her mind, but nobody else in the book, in the novel, is aware of what's going on, really.
So the book, in some ways, was a COVID baby, right? You wrote it during COVID, or at least it's been 2.5 years.
I wrote it during the coronavirus lockdowns. I wrote a lot of the vocabulary in the book, the language. I was sort of experimenting with language of grief and lamentation. A lot of the language of the book draws from the coronavirus pandemic. So there's a chapter, maybe I could read from it.
Yes, could you?
You know, it's about, how it's about a change in season, and about how the season changes from a very fevered sort of season to one that's calmer. So I'll just read
Yeah.
out a little bit. I wanted to also, this is an interesting section. It is really about decay and about perishability. Warm flesh is prone to decay. That is how it has always been. People crumple up like used tissue. Death finds them sooner or later, their countenance altered by disease, their spirit mangled by destiny on a rampage. Everyone vanishes. Everyone grows insensible and disintegrates, although a few like me defy permanent erasure and linger on the lip of non-existence. Only a few like me talk through the void that is their lot, and only a few like me discover willing listeners. These bugs and mites and other tiny creatures faring through wisps of sunlight have heard my stories over and over again. And you, alert, sentient, perishable, how could I forget you? You have not abandoned me. You have remained here by my side, allowing me to reminisce and observe. So she's addressing the reader. This dead narrator addresses the reader every now and then and lets them into her world, while the world, the universe of the novel is never privy to her thoughts and feelings.
But so, it is a book about loss,
Yeah.
and it's a book really tinged with grief, right? And I wanted to ask you in some ways, and I'm going to ask you to just read that one section right at the beginning,
Yeah.
about the Zari silk
Yeah,
saris, because I want everybody to get a feel of really how much and what she lost and how you describe it and the
So
feel.
the first chapter really sets the tone of the book, and it's an evocative section that I'll read out. This is my favorite part of the house, the storeroom. It's tiny, really. There was barely enough room for me to stand inside it while I was alive. Everything is exactly the way it was all those years ago when the storeroom was built to accommodate all the worldly requirements of my life. Here are the Godrej Almeras, all four of them, standing in pairs and facing each other. This one to my left has some of my saris, the Banarsis. They no longer hang from satin hangers. They have been folded and wrapped in malmal as though they were corpses of hand-woven silk and gold. Everything inside the storeroom is a corpse of some sort. Here is the corpse of a winter evening. There is the corpse of a trip to Europe. Everywhere there are corpses of charmed days and perfumed nights, stilled before their time. I could wrap a Banarsi around what used to be my slender but pleasingly plump in all the right places body, my husband used to say, even now, when all that is left of me is this dismembered voice. It wouldn't be obvious to my daughter, who has been coming into the storeroom for the nearly 3 decades that I have been dead, to unfold and refold the saris in a variety of ways so that the fabric doesn't tear, that I have draped one of my favorites around me. Maybe I'll pick the cobalt blue Katan silk with Meenakari work. I can still feel the smell of zari on it. Pure gold zari has the type of smell that can take you back to your own wedding when you were beautiful, when your body was a flute, whispery with all that was yet to come. So it's really about, how the zari and the saris evoke a certain feeling and a certain longing for a life that was truncated by the onset of disease.
Yeah. So, in some ways, so she dies of cancer, right?
She dies. It's an unnamed disease, but yeah, I mean, since you've asked that question, I lost my mother to cancer when I was 15 years old. So that nugget of personal history has crept into the novel.
Yeah.
But when you write fiction, the story changes and protagonists change a lot on the page. So the story is no longer my mother's story. It really is a story of grief and of young people who perhaps have lost parents when they were very, very young, and who have known bereavement when they were young.
Yeah. Because, and in some ways, I asked you this, and I said, the Whaler,
Yeah.
who is this young girl who deals with this loss. She's she's an adolescent,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it changes her, of course, completely.
Yeah.
And she then starts writing these very, very sort of melancholic pieces, right? And her professor tells her to find something else, right? And then
So she's when she's very young, she starts writing because she wants to impress her English teacher, and she starts writing these really morbid stories. And her teacher senses that there's something wrong with her life and asks her why she's writing these morbid stories. So she says that my mother's really sick and she retches a lot, and when she retches, she sounds as though a porcupine is stuck in her throat. So the teacher's concerned, of course. Then the teacher asks her, what is it that you love to do? So she says, I love to swim. So then the teacher advises her, why don't you write about swimming? Write about something that you love to do. And so she attempts to write a happy story. That's really the Whaler in her adolescence. But then she grows up to be this really melancholic adult, and she joins an advertising firm, which is really an exuberant workplace, where people are young and happy and they party a lot and they drink a lot. And she finds herself isolated from that crowd. So she's just someone who can't relate to happiness, I suppose. She doesn't know what happiness is. And so she's stuck in this melancholic bubble and attempts very hard to get out of it, but it follows her and it sort of encapsulates her in so many ways.
Yeah. So, her sister, however, is a different kettle of fish in
Yeah.
a way, right?
Yeah.
Toon, because of cartoon, right? Isn't that?
So she's called Toon. She's named Toon. So both the entire novel has nicknames. So each character has a nickname. The Whalers called the Whaler from a stack of LPs, Bob Marley and the Whalers. And Toon is called Toon because as a child she loved watching cartoons. She's a really hot and sexy sort of woman, and she sort of does her own thing in life. She's dating her boss, who's a coffee startup CEO, and she's just someone who really wants to live her life entirely and fully. Having said that, Toon is also a character. She's also in grief. She was very, very young when her mother dies, and it's obviously in her subconscious, it's embedded there. She doesn't realize she's in grief. So her way of dealing with her grief is by really living life to the fullest and by enjoying every moment. And the reason why she and the Whaler don't talk as much is because the Whaler is caught up in the past. The Whaler is stuck, in memories of her mother, while Toon really wants to move on. So each character, like the Whaler and Toon, each of them have their own equation with the storeroom. So the storeroom is also it's the central conceit of this novel. It's this really claustrophobic space for a character like Toon, who doesn't like entering it. But for the Whaler, it is a repository of memory and nostalgia, because when the Whaler enters the storeroom, she finds herself unfolding and refolding her mother's saris. She finds herself looking through old photographs, and she is steeped in nostalgia, and that it pulls her back. So, the storeroom becomes a repository of the past for the Whaler. For Toon, it's an outdated space and one that she's averse to and wants to run away from.
The book is also very much a Delhi novel.
Yeah.
And, it is a Delhi that has changed, a Delhi that has gone. It's a Delhi that is also very fragile, a Delhi that exists only in memory.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that and how the scaffolding of the book, as you said, was real? But, so, there's this one bit where the mother meets her husband, LP.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that, the kind of
So
research?
that's an interesting scene. I might read from it. Basically, in 1976, Delhi, there was a play called Sultan Razia, which happened, in this old ruin. It's called the Purana Killa. And what was happening in Delhi in the 1970s was that there was a lot of experimental theatre. And theatre groups had come up. People were moving away from very typical productions, Shakespeare and Ibsen, and they wanted to do their own plays. They wanted to create their own idiom. And so Razia Sultan, the play Razia Sultan actually happened. And in my fictional universe, the two characters, the dead woman and her husband, who's called LP, they actually meet at that. At the Purana Killa. So perhaps I could read a little bit
Yes,
from
yes.
that. Section which is about a change in season and the fact that just shifting a little bit to that section, because this also describes how the book begins in early spring, which is really also a time of political tumult in Delhi, and then it moves to a time when the summer heat is at its utmost. So everything alters. The sun shifts its position in the sky. Spring dies of anaphylactic shock. Summer arrives, and with it the heat. Milk spoils, fruit rots, blood turns noxious, love curdles. Flowers ooze pus, infecting pollinators. The heat spawns ruin. Only I am untouched by its virulence. Only I am immune to its many fevers. But I observe its spread, how quick the spread, and how insidious the affliction. They're all in its grip. So the fact that, I was in lockdown and the fact that the coronavirus pandemic was rampant, I think impacted the language of the novel. So so it seeps in fevers and anaphylactic shock, and the fact that it was an infected season. The season was infected by something. And also this portends what's going to happen later on in the novel. That things go bad, things rot. Like milk rots in summer, so things rot for the family as well.
But so what was so talking about why Delhi becomes the heart of the novel. Well, not the heart, but the scene of the novel in some ways. If the storeroom is where the dead mother has her memories and is alive, the Delhi of the 70s is where she's grown up. It's where it's littered with the memories of her love and her life and her being alive. And I want you to talk about. There's this scene you've got from the 70s where she's married, where she's a young bride, and she's sitting at a table for breakfast, and her father-in-law is peeling.
He's peeling oranges. He's peeling oranges, and he offers her an orange.
Yes,
and so there was a certain culture, in Delhi families, a certain tehzeeb. And Delhi, of course, was, it was populated by immigrants. People moved after partition. Your family, my family, all of them came from Pakistan. They came from Peshawar, Lahore, and they set up homes in Delhi. And so back in the 1970s, when they had managed to, say, build a house and live in it, there was a lot of... culturally, the city was full of affection. It was it was a hub of cosmopolitan...
Delhi before it became a rotten political capital, gasping for air city.
Before it became a political capital. And so interestingly, the novel captures, it's also set in 2020. So there are two Delhis that exist.
Yeah.
Just like there are two narrative voices, the dead woman and the wailer, her daughter. So there are two Delhis. One is in the 70s and the other is this modern contemporary Delhi. But I mean, I wouldn't use the word rot for the city.
Okay.
But it is also, that's really where Shaheen Bagh happened. The anti-CAA protests took place. A lot of Muslim women came out and protested against a bill that discriminated against minorities.
Yeah.
So Delhi is actually still the throbbing heart of the country.
It wins your heart in a way, and then you can never leave it, and that's what the drug is.
And that's what the drug is. So, having said that, do you want to talk about the anti-CAA protests?
Yes.
And then maybe
I also wanted to talk to you about really the aspect of how, in some ways, both the mother's life, where there's the emergency protests, and she wants to join, but doesn't because she's now this young married woman, and sort of the domesticity sort of pulls her back.
Yeah.
And Wailer, who is sort of a observer and goes to the CA protest, and how that changes her life from being an observer and then getting sort of involved.
Yeah.
Talk about the city and its residents and
Yeah.
protest in some
So
ways.
the
it was come-
mother, when she reminisces about the past as a young woman in the 1970s, it's during the emergency and there are protests going on in universities. And she's a newly married woman and still doing her MA. And her mother-in-law tells her that, look, you're married now. Don't participate in the protest. And so she, and of course she's a budding activist. She's an intellectual woman, independent thinking woman. But she decides that, now she's married and she's got this husband and she's got a family to come back to. And so she makes that conscious decision not to participate in the protest. While then in 2020, her daughter, the Wailer, who's growing up amidst the anti-CA protests, inadvertently gets involved. So the daughter is, because she's worked in advertising, she's not really connected with what's going on politically in the city. One of her colleagues, a young Muslim art director called Nawab Zada, he gets involved in the protests. She accompanies him and then she senses the mood of the crowd and she senses what's going on and decides to become a part of that. So the novel is really also about, the anti-CA protests, the kind of anthems that were sung during the protests, the kind of slogans that hovered in the air, and the kind of activism that Delhi is also known for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that it's also, what I found interesting was also how you make advertising this world and you sort of bring it to life, because you did
Yeah.
advertising yourself.
Yeah.
And I know that there is this, you talk about the poster,
Yeah.
the ad campaign about the Volkswagen,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And you go into advertising offices even today, and that's like your masterpiece, and there is this aspect of that. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that bit and how it, in
So
some ways-
advertising, the Wailer works in advertising. It's this really exuberant world, and it's the antithesis to her personality, because she's this melancholic character, but she works in advertising, and advertising seems to seep into everything. So while they're passing by a protest, they see the slogan which says "utterly butterly barbaric." So utterly butterly barbaric is actually drawn from utterly butterly delicious, which is the Amul campaign tagline. And she notices it and she finds it hilarious, because she says that even a protest draws from advertising language. And then of course there's the Volkswagen campaign, which becomes an emblem of modernity, because she has the Volkswagen campaign pinned to her softboard in her office. And when she's sort of romantically drawn to one of the, young new CEO joins, and he seems to like her and she seems to like him, he brings that Volkswagen campaign as a peace offering when she quits her job and goes off to Coorg for a bit. He brings that along and it becomes a talking point for the two of them. So it breaks the ice between the two of them, and it sort of facilitates their romance.
Yeah.
But advertising does that. And advertising, it may seem like this really superficial commercial world. It's got its own language and its own idiom, which seeps into it. We're all products of advertising. We all buy brands because they're advertised. We see billboards, from on our way to the airport and back. We see the city steeped in brands and we buy them, and it changes us culturally. So the novel is really, a cultural tribute to advertising as well.
And it is also very much, I know that you say it's not autobiography, and there are parts of it is, but it's also very much sort of a world where you talk really about and deal with grief. I think that there is a personal loss that you try and deal with. And can you talk really about how you were trying to create this vocabulary to express what you were feeling? Because in some ways, we tend to be people who are very much like Toon, where grief, and especially if you've lost someone significant when you're a young, you carry it in your heart. You can't escape it. It's very much part of you, right?
Yeah.
But there is this idea that you have to get over and move on. Life isn't, life exists beyond grief.
Yeah.
But what do you do when you carry it in your heart and it's with you everywhere and it's in your skin?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question, and also, grief pervades the novel, but the language and the vocabulary and the syntax of the novel is not steeped in unhappiness.
No,
It's a
no,
different-
it isn't.
Yeah, so it's a
There's-
tragic comic
Yeah.
novel. The dead mother has a morbid sense of humor. Her
Yeah.
daughter certainly gets into predicaments which are really hilarious for the reader.
But-
So grief is something that one processes and deals with in our, each of us has our own way of dealing with it. And in the novel, the Vela, she confronts her grief by, looking at her mother's belongings and taking care of them. Toon stays away from all of it. But Toon too has a breakdown towards the end of the novel.
Yeah.
And, admits to having memories of her mother. And so the novel, is actually a tribute to nostalgia. I wanted to talk about this one critic, Dennis Walder, who calls nostalgia memory's stepchild.
Yeah.
So, everything in the objects in the storeroom in particular trigger a certain memory which take you back to a really happy time in your life. So the saris take the dead mother back to a time when she was beautiful and young and her body was ripe with possibility and she was sensual. She was a sensual creature. She enjoyed her relationship with her husband. And her saris now wrapped in malmala, almost like corpses. And they miss the contours of her body. They miss the fact that they can no longer have dinner with her husband.
Yeah.
And so the whole novel is strewn with these images that are meant to evoke nostalgia and take you back to a time in your life when you were happy.
Yeah.
There's also this French novelist called Marcel Proust. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's written In Search of Lost Time. It's in 7 volumes. I haven't read it, I have to admit,
Yeah.
but because it's in 7 volumes. But he does write about it's a tiny sponge cake called mandolin. When dipped in tea, it triggers a memory of his life in provincial France. So he belonged to a really small village in France. And every time he tastes a mandolin dipped in tea, it brings back memories of his childhood, of a lost childhood. And that, I think, is what I've attempted to do, in the narrative, in the narrative voice of the dead woman in particular. I've tried to evoke a lost time.
Yeah. So, we've talked about the 2 daughters.
Yeah.
But, this grief also touches the husband, LP.
Yeah.
And I, what I thought was really tender and very evocative is that she's watching over him and she still feels jealous and he's trying to be the mother and the father.
Yeah.
And then there's this very beautiful line where he says something. He says she says he's never once referred to me as his dead wife.
Yeah.
Toon's coffee.
Yeah.
The coffee. They say,
When there's a guest in the house, whenever there's a guest in the house, LP never refers to his dead wife as my dead wife. He just says, "Oh, my wife once did this," or this is my wife's crockery on the table. So the dead woman who's hovering around the house, she observes that, and the fact that LP never refers to her as, my late wife or my dead wife. Like, if our spouses were to perhaps pass away, we would use that language, but he never does that. And LP then becomes actually the tragic figure in this novel because he's just someone who's had to don the role of a mother and a father, taken on responsibilities for both the daughters, and at the same time attempted to move on. There's a reference to LP attempting
to move on,
romantic relationships, but failing in those as well because the memory of his dead wife comes back. And so the dead woman still manages to get jealous, because there's a reference to someone interesting he's met at his club and someone, he's made eye contact with. And the minute he talks about that to his friends, the dead woman gets jealous. So the book really is about, she's dead, but her feelings and her emotions are all that of a live human being.
Yeah.
It's everything that we feel now.
And also, I think in some ways that if you look at it in the idea of grief, losing, and we've talked about losing friends, and you lose your part, a part of yourself, and you lose your this thing. But when his 2 daughters find love in some ways or find partnership, and he in a way is like his wife, sort of hanging on to a memory of a past, and he can't let go of her either.
Absolutely.
So while she's stuck in the storeroom, he's stuck in a mental version of a storeroom in his head.
Absolutely, and he too is attempting to move on by refurbishing the house. They're
Yes.
getting rid of the bed, the conjugal bed, and so he's attempting to move on in his own way, but fails to do so because the whole house seems steeped in memories of this dead woman, and so you sense that in the house also there's a pervading decay. The things are in decay. If we go back to Marcus Aurelius and his observations on decay, the house is in decay because freshness is not allowed inside. There's just too much memory,
Yeah.
and the book asks this pertinent question: how much of the past should we allow? How much should we dwell in the past? Should we allow ourselves to move on at all?
And on this very interesting philosophical moment, we are going to open up for questions. Any questions? Gentlemen up there. We have time for about 2, but I would also like a lady. Let's be. Two gentlemen.
You mentioned in passing
Yeah.
that your novel is strewn with lot of images.
Yes.
There was a fantastic imagery, like you likening your adolescence with a bansuri flute.
Yes.
Flute. My question is, how far you are influenced by the Marcel Proust, the French author?
Yeah, well, I'm influenced by his writings on nostalgia, and I'm influenced by his own images. I'm also influenced by other authors. For instance, Salman Rushdie, in one of his very famous essays called "Imaginary Homelands," he writes about memory and how memory plays tricks on us, and how when we try to recollect, we are all gifted only with partial recall. So we can only recollect a town or a city that we have left behind partially and imprecisely. So if you've read Midnight's Children is a very digressional and inaccurate account of the city of Bombay. It's a beautiful, exuberant account of the city of Bombay, but it's not factually accurate. So he's written in Imaginary Homelands that memory is partial. You'll only reclaim a small amount of what you have left behind, a small geography and an imprecise geography. The geography also changes. It's never what you have left behind. So that influenced my writing to a large extent.
So I'm going to ask you how long did it take for you to write this? And as someone who is obsessed with perfection, I know we've talked about this. Is it difficult to let your manuscript go? Do you always sort of want to polish it? How long do you hang on to that?
Well, I really worry about sentences, and for me, the perfectly crafted sentence is important, and which is why I also worry about overwriting sometimes. So it took me about 2.5 years. It was primarily during lockdown that I wrote this novel, but I really, thought that I had really crafted it and sculpted it, and I really didn't want too much editorial intervention, to be very honest with you. And for me, good writing, and also because I've done a creative writing course from the University of East Anglia, where again the emphasis is on craft and the craft of writing more than the story. So for me, good writing always meant great sentences. It's only when you read other authors, you read Indian authors, regional Indian authors, you read writing in translation, that you really understand the value of a good story, and the fact that it's not just the craft, but the story that you're trying to tell, and a really raw story told with unfinished sentences or imperfect sentences which have their own syntax, can also be beautiful in their own way.
Okay. And on this note, I think it's 5:30. We're supposed to wrap up. Yes, we're just on time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much for the lively discussion. Mothers go, but motherhood never goes.